Cremation is a combination of fire and the body as part of a mortuary ritual. Cremation as a term is used to describe both an archaeological phenomenon, the burnt human remains that we recover within archaeological sites, but also a social phenomenon, the practices that led to the transformation of the body. Cremation is a secondary burial treatment, but one in which there's a fiery transformation of the body. This transformation event is often a spectacle and a sensory experience for those who are nearby. Now, archaeologists have traditionally overlooked cremations because they've thought that a lot of the important archaeological and bioarchaeological data went up in flames during the cremation event. The new insights from archaeological science is showing that that's not always the case. In this video, I'm going to dive into some of the key pieces of our study of cremations within the archaeology of death. We often describe cremated human remains as ashes, but this is a bit misleading. The ashes that we see at the end of a cremation process today have been significantly modified and significantly processed. In a modern cremation, the body is burnt within an industrial scale blast furnace for several hours. At the end of that process, there are still recognizable pieces of bone within that container. Those remains are then collected and placed into a tumbler with steel ball bearings. And that tumbler is spun around, and the ball bearings break up the last remaining recognizable pieces of bone into a fine powder. And that fine powder is what we think of when we think of cremated remains. In the past, the process would have been very different. People would have had to go out and collect the fuel for the pyre in advance of the burning event. Now, the scale and the temperature would have been variable and also impacted by the availability of fuel. In certain landscapes, there would have been plenty of available firewood or charcoal to create a pyre. In other landscapes, however, maybe drier, more desertic landscapes, this process may have been a very costly one. At the end of the cremation, people would have collected the human remains from the pyre, and they could have processed them further at that point, including washing them, maybe breaking them up and grinding them down into smaller pieces. And all of these processes have impacted what archaeologists find in the archaeological record as it relates to cremations. As we'll see, even though the transformation of the body has significantly impacted and fragmented those human remains, there still are important lines of evidence that archaeologists can explore to understand these social processes in a much more nuanced way than was available even 2 decades ago. There are 4 lines of evidence that archaeologists use to be able to reconstruct the cremation process. The first are the remains of the bodies themselves. We refer to these as cremains or cremated human remains. The second is the pyre location itself. Now, the pyre is the location where the body was burnt. Sometimes these locations can be visible due to the large thermal signatures they leave in the sediment, the large amounts of charcoal they would have, and even trace amounts of cremains that may have been left within the pyre. The third line of evidence are the objects that are interred with an individual. These can be divided into 2 different categories. The first are pyre goods. Now, pyre goods are items that are placed with the body on the pyre as the body is being burnt. These items will often show evidence of heat damage from being fired at a very high temperature along with the body. The second type of object are grave goods, which are interred with the individual when they're buried, but would not have been on the body or placed next to the body on the pyre location itself. Now, the fourth line of evidence are the vessels or containers or structures in which these cremains were placed. Sometimes we see cremains placed in ceramic vessels or pots. Other times they're placed into chambers, sometimes in individual chambers, but it may also be in larger collective ossuary chambers full of cremated human remains. We'll see this again with this division between kind of an individualizing treatment or collectivizing treatment. And we also want to pay attention to the material and how we might be able to interpret what that material may signify, whether it's a bundle or a stone structure or a clay pot. There have been several important technological and analytical advancements in the study of cremations in the last few decades. The first one is within the study of bioarchaeology. Now, bioarchaeologists who study cremains are looking for the same types of information that they are when they're studying primary inhumations. They want to know the age of the individual when they died. They want to know the cause of death, if possible. Is there evidence of disease or trauma? What is potential biological sex of that individual? Now, the problem with cremation is that oftentimes the skeleton is fragmented to the point where many of these lines of evidence are impossible to find. But they're not always impossible to find. In certain cases, when archaeologists can identify things like trauma or disease markers, they will report that information. But we have to recognize the limitations of our sample when many of the bodies are fragmented to the point where that analysis is impossible. Now, when bioarchaeologists are trying to look at some of these categories, such as age, for example, they may not be able to go to a fine, detailed age analysis of an individual between 20 and 25, but they can distinguish between the cremated remains of an infant versus that of an adult. So oftentimes we're dealing with broader categories of identity when we're studying cremations. Bioarchaeologists also can look to the fragmentation process itself to give insight into the cremation process. Through the use of experimental archaeology, bioarchaeologists have recreated and burnt pig skeletons to see how the bones change during that process and break apart during the process of cremation. There's some telltale signatures on bone that's burnt when the collagen is still intact, which means it's relatively fresh after the individual died. Now, some of those markers, such as thumbnail arced fractures, are things that we can identify in the archaeological record on the cremains themselves. These are different than bones that are burnt when they've been fully dried out and the collagen has degraded away, where the breakage points are going to be much more random and much less regular. For decades, archaeologists thought that it was impossible to get a radiocarbon date from human cremated remains. But advances in the last couple decades have made it possible to do that. Now, when archaeologists are dating a normal inhumation grave, they're dating the bone collagen within that bone or tooth. In cremations, the burning process has burnt away and destroyed the collagen, so it's impossible to date that organic matter. Instead, archaeologists will date the mineralization within the cremated remains. The bone carbonate is what they're actually dating. Now, the bone carbonate traps in all the available carbon that existed when the bone was fired, and these loose cells reorganize and pack themselves together. Through the process of treating the samples, the people who are running these radiocarbon analyses can release the carbon that is trapped within the bone carbonate and date that. There's an important distinction to make between the radiocarbon dates we get from bone collagen and individuals and from cremains. In bone collagen, we're dating the last time that carbon was added to that tissue. So we're dating the death of the individual. When we're dating cremains, we're not dating the death of the individual. We're dating the burning environment of that individual. Now, there's also a complicating factor where if you're using the fuel that you're using, the carbon from that can also be trapped into the cremated remains. So sometimes we get something that's called the old wood effect, where if you're if you're using timbers that are 300 years old, and you're putting them on a pyre, some of that carbon may get into your to the cremains, and if you start dating that, it's going to suggest that the burning event was much earlier in time than the actual time that was there. So when you're dating cemeteries, or you're trying to understand the timing of a cremation cemetery, you want to date a lot of different remains to see how variable the burning environment was. And it could tell you if people are reusing old timbers as part of the cremation process, or are they using relatively fresh, new growth wood. Isotopic analysis continues to be tricky for the study of cremains. The process of burning transforms the bone structure and makes it impossible to do the same kinds of analyses on the cremated bones as we do on inhumed bones. However, if there are teeth that survive the firing process, you can run the isotopic analyses on those teeth, and people have started to do this in the last few years to still be able to look at strontium and oxygen isotopes, for example, to give a sense of mobility and where that individual grew up and where they were found, and see if they have moved throughout their life. Another form of analysis that archaeologists use to study cremains is called FTIR analysis. FTIR is a technique where we're able to assess the crystallinity of a particular specimen. This is really important when we're trying to take a sample for radiocarbon dating, because we want to know that the bone has been fully calcined, fully heated through before we run that sample. Now, archaeologists have also suggested that FTIR might provide more information to us. When we run an FTIR analysis, what we get back is a UV spectra, and the peaks along that spectra coincide with particular elements within that bone structure. There is something called the cyanamide peak that shows up in some cremated remains, but not in others. Archaeologists have suggested that perhaps the peak at the cyanamide location on the UV spectra is due to the body being burnt in an ammonia-rich environment. That is to say, an environment where there is a lot of organic material such as flesh. So archaeologists suggested that this cyanamide peak is associated with a body being cremated fresh. Now, in other cremated remains samples, archaeologists have observed that there is no peak at the cyanamide location. And so what they suggest is that these bones that were cremated were burnt once they had been defleshed. And there's a lot of experimental and more analysis that needs to go in to really confirm these types of patterns. But it's a hint at how we can use these more complex scientific analyses to understand the dynamic social processes that are part of cremation. In addition to advances in the study of the cremains themselves, archaeologists have also been making great advances in the study of other material culture that impacts our analysis. One of those is the study of charcoal. There have been a lot of work recently on trying to see how wood charcoal is transformed under different firing temperatures and at different firing lengths. So when archaeologists excavate a pyre location, they may be able to look at the charcoal and assess what temperature the cremated pyre was able to get to. And that would also hint at the type of fragmentation of the body we would expect to see as a result of that fire. Now, the analysis of charcoal, again, is just one example of these other forms of material culture that we need to draw upon in order to have a more holistic view of the cremation process. Along with the analytical advancements that archaeologists have been making, we've also been taking steps to develop a deeper theoretical understanding and interpretive understanding of cremations. Now, the main focus for the study of cremations is on this fiery transformation. This is a visible sensory event, a very rapid transformation of a body into a different substance. Now, this transformation that occurs in other secondary burial practices as well has consequences for what happens with the body. Rather than a complete singular body, we have divisible parts that then can be sent on different pathways. Those substances can be used in different types of ways. Archaeologists have also looked at the concepts of social memory and personhood within the study of cremains. Social memory is all about how individuals are remembered or forgotten. Sometimes the forgetting is intentional and is a part of a process of losing an individual identity and commemorating a collective identity. Now, cremations, as with other secondary burial practices, transform an individual from a recognizable body to a substance that may be distanced from that individual identity. Personhood is all about how do people in that particular cultural context define who is a person. Personhood sometimes is conferred based on different achievements that someone makes. Sometimes it's a byproduct of the age of an individual as they become a full person in that cultural context. Now, these theoretical advancements are just skimming the surface of what cremations can do, but really it drives back this idea of looking at the entire sequence of events, the entire pathways of the body that cremations take, and the alternative experiences that exist within those different stages. The cremation process is one that archaeologists are hopefully going to be making significant analytical and significant theoretical advances on in the future, and it'll be exciting to see where the discipline goes.